Well, today we're going to talk about these connections between infections, the immune system, and the brain. And then I'll share with you some case studies that I hope will be helpful for you as you identify patients that are suffering from these immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders, and some guidance on some of the treatments, and then how these targets in the autoimmune brain panel may be able to help you as you identify and define treatment, and then also work to identify the underlying root cause. So today I'll share with you a little bit about the biology so that you can see really how infections can trigger neuropsychiatric symptoms. And then why is it that certain infections trigger these immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders, such as PANDAS and PANS, even neurologic Lyme, long COVID, and many other types of disorders that PANDAS and PANS, if you haven't heard of, really is a medical model for many of these other chronic debilitating neuropsychiatric disorders. We'll talk through some case studies of patients, and then we'll look at the therapeutic categories that show clinical efficacy in treating many of these immune-mediated disorders that are secondary to infection. And then we'll talk a little bit about how these biological targets that are in the autoimmune brain panel, and it's formerly known as the Cunningham Panel. So if you see that around, don't be confused. We are making expansions and improvements to it to be able to make it more relevant, including some treatment algorithms. And then to start off, we really want to talk about a problem here, and that is that there are over 800 million individuals who suffer worldwide from various neurologic, psychiatric, and behavioral disorders. And these have many common names that we're very familiar with. The challenge here is that the standard of care is typically treatment with psychotropic drugs. And the other part that plays a role here is that anywhere from 20 to 60% of these patients in different categories are what we would deem as treatment resistant, meaning that they don't respond to 2 or 3 different courses of these neuropsychiatric or psychotropic drugs. So why is this still a problem today? Well, it partly has to do with the disorders that are being diagnosed by symptoms and not by biology. For instance, if an individual has motor or vocal tics that are more than 12 months, that is the definition of Tourette syndrome. And irrespective of what the underlying root cause is, these categories or these labels or names and diagnoses don't have anything to do with the underlying biology. So we're here to talk about really that there's this interconnection between infections and various types of even non-infectious triggers, such as those in the environment, and our immune system, which we do know in biology and medicine that is the case. Well, our immune system, as we know, produces antibodies. It also produces cytokines, but the immune system can go awry. And when it does, it actually impacts brain function. And so there's this interconnection, but it is also supported by what we might call a genetic predisposition, not to psychiatric disorders, but to immune dysfunction, in the sense that your body or the body of these individuals and their immune system has some kind of issue that doesn't allow it to accurately determine self from non-self. So let's start with the JAMA Psychiatry article that was published in 2019. And the question of, can infections really trigger an autoimmune response that leads to these neuropsychiatric disorders? So this was a study of over 1 million individuals in Denmark, and they followed them from birth to age 18. And what they found was that if any one of these patients were hospitalized for a severe infection, that the risk of developing mental disorders increased by more than 80% with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, autism, OCD, ADD, ADHD, personality disorders, oppositional defiance disorder, tics disorders, and many others. So there was an editorial that was published alongside of this, that said, how could exposure to infections affect the brain mechanistically to give rise to mental disorders? Circulating autoantibodies that enter the brain via compromised blood-brain barrier bind to neurotransmitter receptors is a potential explanation, and this mechanism has been proposed in PANDAS and other mental disorders. So we'll talk about today basically that, looking at these autoantibodies that circulate as a result of an infection and are directed against certain brain targets that lead to these different types of mental disorders and neuropsychiatric disorders and symptoms. And so we do know that a large portion of neuropsychiatric disorders are caused by an infection-triggered autoimmune dysfunction. The problem is you can't tell by looking at an individual which ones are and which ones aren't. It has great importance when you look at what is the proper treatment for the patient. So one thing that is contributed unintentionally to make it difficult to diagnose these patients is the specialization in medicine. So we see psychiatry, psychology is practiced separately from immunology, which is practiced separate from infectious disease, practiced separately from neurology. Whereas we do know that the body is not isolated in that manner, and therefore infectious diseases impact psychiatry, psychology, neurology, and immunology, as we just mentioned, in this interconnection. And therefore, cross-disciplinary and collaborative medical care can accelerate the diagnosis and treatment of these chronic disorders. And this is what molecular biosciences has been pioneering and about, because there are a lot of patients who really are suffering unnecessarily because of the inability to identify the underlying root cause. So if we think about how this occurs biologically, we all get infections, and we get exposed to infections literally every day of our life. Our body, through our innate and adaptive immune system, produces antibodies that recognize these infectious organisms. Everybody now, even the lay, knows about an immune response to SARS-CoV-2 and antibodies that are made. In some people, and again, these are certain individuals with certain types of genetic predisposition, particular antibodies that they produce that are directed against these infections are against a target that is identical or very similar to targets in our body, in these cases in the brain. We'll talk about molecular mimicry in just a moment. And then what happens is it interrupts brain function. These antibodies, as was mentioned in the JAMA Psychiatry article, will cross the blood-brain barrier, and you'll see patients exhibiting various neuropsychiatric symptoms. And as mentioned, the standard of care is for treatment with psychotropic drugs. In these particular patients, they are treatment resistant because it is not the underlying root of the issue for what they're dealing with. So these patients, when placed on immune modulators, anti-infectives for these underlying infections, and anti-inflammatory agents, we really do see some amazing and remarkable recoveries. And in many cases, they may be suffering for years, and in some cases for decades, to see them recover and actually regain function. So let me just share with you a little bit of history that is kind of interesting. You know, it wasn't that long ago that treatment for mental illnesses and neuropsychiatric illnesses looked like this, from lobotomies, bloodletting, restraints, asylums, even drilling holes in the head, until the 50s, when psychiatric medications were invented and introduced. And it has spread to widespread use. In fact, over 60 million individuals in the US are on some form of psychiatric medication. Again, remembering that there is a true value to the treatment of these, but the cases we're going to talk about is it's not treating the underlying root cause. And then in 2010, a landmark study showed that the second and third generation psychiatric meds were really no better than the original ones. So another interesting fact is that these autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders that are triggered by infections are not new. In fact, back in the 1600s and 1700s, a condition called Sydenham chorea, which used to be known as St. Vitus's dance, would be manifested in children that had a strep infection, and you would see these abnormal movements, uncontrollable movements. And in 1894, Sir William Osler described what he called these bizarre and percipitive behaviors in children with chorea minor. And what we do know is that group A strep is the causative agent. It is also the causative agent of acute rheumatic fever, in which these antibodies are directed against the heart valve. In a certain percentage of these patients, they will manifest what's known as Sydenham chorea, which is the neurologic manifestation of acute rheumatic fever. Mostly in the US, these have been taken care of. We don't see it as frequently. And if it is, it's addressed with treatment with penicillin. So your challenge really is that these neuropsychiatric disorders that are secondary to infections and immune response require thinking outside of the box. And often that is what is more challenging because the standard of care, as I mentioned, is to treat the symptoms. So let me talk for a moment about the nomenclature, because sometimes this is also a source of confusion. And the nomenclature for what we're talking about here starts with, let's say, PANDAS. So if you're familiar with PANDAS, it stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with a streptococcal infection. And this was coined by Dr. Susan Sweeto and her colleagues when they identified multiple cases. There was a publication of 50 cases in which sudden onset of obsessive compulsive disorder was followed by an onset bout of streptococcal infections. Since then, we've also known that other microbes can trigger this, and even environmental and other biological factors. So you have these infectious triggers and potentially these non-infectious triggers, and this is what brought about the term PANS. And PANS stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndromes. And in 2015, a consortium of the PANS group got together and identified this category, at which you can see PANDAS is a subset of that. Now, what happens if you're an adult? Well, you can't have PANDAS or you can't have PANS. You can have an infection-triggered autoimmune neuropsychiatric condition, but you can't be diagnosed with PANDAS or PANS. As a result of that, there have been other terms that have been coined, like ANDL, which sometimes stands for Adult Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with Lyme, or Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with Lyme. What we are seeing more and would prefer to use is terms that refer to the underlying biology, such as the autoimmune encephalopathy, secondary to infection, or basal ganglia encephalitis, which we'll talk about why the basal ganglia would be talked about in that function, or just autoimmune encephalitis. But recently, we're talking about an immune dysfunction that results in neuropsychiatric and behavioral symptoms. So just remember when you hear these terms, we're looking really at an underlying infection-triggered immune-mediated disorder that results in various types of psychiatric symptoms. And the most important part is the infection trigger and the immune dysfunction. And the manifestations can be multiple, and we'll talk about those in our case studies. So the reason we talk about this is potentially a basal ganglia encephalitis, that a lot of research has gone into identifying that the inflammation and these autoantibodies are crossing the blood-brain barrier and binding to the basal ganglia. So what you can see in this study is that in certain parts of the brain, such as the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus, there's an increase in volume in patients that were children associated with OCD and tics after a strep infection. And what you can also see here is on the right that the basal ganglia is responsible for voluntary motor control, procedural learning, cognitive functions, emotional functions, and eye movement. And so you can see that once these are interfered with or blocked or maybe even activated, that you can see the resulting symptoms correlating with these types of biological movements. So another question is really, why are certain infections more frequently associated with these autoimmune encephalopathies? And they tend to be these groups here, such as strep, obviously, for PANDAS and PANS, or PANDAS with the S at the end stands for strep. But for PANS, it can be influenza, varicella, mycoplasma, Lyme, Babesia, Bartonella, Coxsackie virus, and others. And part of the reason is that what we do see is there are sequence homologies between these infections and certain brain proteins. And we won't go into detail that today because we do want to get to the case studies, but that would be something that in a future lecture or something we can share and talk more about. I'm just going to briefly talk about molecular mimicry because it is a biological condition that can be and is believed to be accountable for many autoimmune disorders and many of these different types of immune dysfunctions. So what is molecular mimicry? It's just a process where there are protein sequence similarities between a foreign agent, whether it's an infection or some other foreign protein, and your own peptides or your own proteins, whether it's in your brain or whether it's in your liver, your kidney, or your thyroid. We're looking at a protein alphabet that only has 20 letters. So at some point, there's going to be a sequence similarity or a common sequence between these infectious agents and parts of our body. And that's really what happens. But our immune system screens those out and tells our body not to make any kind of autoantibody against it. But when this gets dysfunctional, there's this inability to tell self from non-self. So simplistically, if you think about this, I mentioned the epitope, which is really the recognition portion of an organism that the antibodies are made to. And in this case, let's say that our body recognizes a particular epitope. Of course, it'll go through the process of making memory B cells in which these antibodies will be continued to made. But if that epitope is an identical epitope to a motor neuron or let's say, a dopamine receptor, once that's made, these antibodies, which are being produced by the body, will cross-react with these neurons, and you can see these resulting behaviors. And that's what we call molecular mimicry. So simplistically, it's basically the inability to tell between one identity and another identity. We sometimes think of this as friendly fire in the wartime, but it's just an inability to distinguish self from not self. So we see that in strep. There are commonalities between certain M proteins or carbohydrates in the M protein and the other proteins of strep. And you can see the heart valve has some commonality, which again is why we see rheumatic fever. Commonality in the basal ganglia, which is why we will see cases of Sydenham chorea, joints, kidney, etc. So let's move into what is really precision medicine and the importance of identifying what is really the underlying root. Patients can present with very similar symptoms for psychiatric, behavioral, and mental illnesses. And the goal of precision medicine is to identify what the underlying root is. In these cases, looking for immune-mediated neuropsychiatric symptoms, because then you can treat the underlying root of the immune with immune modulators, anti-inflammatory agents, and anti-infectives. And therefore, those that are treated with the traditional psychiatric and psychotropic meds are identified also because they will be responding to those. And so we're working on a treatment algorithm that will help predict which specific treatments based on over 15,000 patients now that we have tested. And we're working to add that to the results of the panel in the future. So let me move over to some case studies here. And these are some case studies in which we have had both testing prior to treatment and testing after treatment. This is an 8-year-old young girl who had numerous psychiatric symptoms. She presented with an abrupt onset of OCD. She had vocal tics, difficulty concentrating, and sensory and motor abnormalities, and a whole host of other symptoms. You can see dysgraphia, which is the loss of fine motor control, and you can see it in drawings or in handwritings. And then the parents reported urinary and sleep problems. This is her autoimmune brain panel test, and we run 5 tests on each patient, their blood test, their metabolic tests, looking for autoantibodies against these different targets, and we'll talk more about those in a second. Here she was positive for anti-lysoganglioside GM1 and positive for anti-tubulin. She had a relapsing remitting course of symptoms. The diagnosis formally was anxiety, OCD, and some unspecified immune disorder. They found that her ASO titers were less than 50, anti-DNase-B was less than 50, and normal IgG titers. Again, strep is not always the cause, as mentioned, that PANS can be other etiologic agents. However, she had 2 significant streptococcal infections previously. And again, remembering that these can elicit an immune response even after the infection. So she had high fever, sore throat, sinus pain, cough, and then a history of frequent ear infections and sinus infections. Interestingly, as mentioned, see that the family had a family history of autoimmune disorders, allergies, frequent bacterial and viral infections, and they were positive for mycoplasma. So in this case, the treatment was a course of azithromycin with rapid symptom improvement, and all symptoms were resolved, returned to baseline after 2 to 3 days of treatment, and her post-treatment results show both the lysoganglioside and the anti-tubulin returning to normal range. And so this is one in which if a patient and their symptoms are caught early, what you can see is that they will respond because the immune system may not have set up for a longer term, or let's say more memory B cell that will continue to elicit these autoantibodies. So we'll talk about a 16-year-old female here that had severe OCD, tics, and this restricted food intake. So this young girl had an abrupt onset at 11. And remembering often, you can see this significant onset that in some cases, one day they're normal, the next day they're not. But also it does occur gradually. So remembering that there's these strict definitions, a gradual onset would not fall under a PANDAS diagnosis, because part of the requirement is it has to be abrupt. This food restriction, which is really believed to be an OCD and not an identity or another issue about body morphology, it's a fear of food contamination, fear of choking, and you can see tics, choreiform movement, concentration difficulties, academic decline, mood dysregulation, urinary urgencies, again, dysgraphia here, and aggressive behavior that prompted 6 calls to the local police. So the testing was done, and we found that she was positive for an activation of what we call this calmodulin CAM kinase 2 enzyme. And we'll talk more about what its function is. The course of illness is she had this relapsing, remitting symptoms with 3 major episodes and a sudden increase in symptoms after another strep exposure. So there's another indication of this being immune-mediated, infection-triggered. But her previous diagnosis was an autoimmune disease not otherwise specified, or post-infectious encephalitis and other diseases involving the immune system. She did have a positive Western blot for Lyme, and again, remembering that many of these other infections have the capability of triggering this, elevated mycoplasma and Coxsackie titers. Didn't get a medical history on this one, but the family history had a maternal, paternal grandmothers with autoimmune disorders and a history of rheumatic fever, siblings with PANDAS. In this case, the treatment was with plasmapheresis and IVIG with symptom improvement. Sometimes they will have and control these symptoms with low-dose psychotropic drugs in order to be able to maintain them. Often these patients will not do well on standard dosing, but this in case the significant improvement in this patient, and as you can see, her CAM kinase post-treatment returned to normal. This is a 20-year-old female with OCD and neuropsychiatric symptoms. She had a gradual onset of OCD, and because of the age and because of the gradual onset, this wouldn't fall into the category of PANDAS or PANS, but you can see the medical model is very similar. Sensory, motor abnormalities, emotional ability, separation anxiety, again, urinary frequency, sleep disturbances, and then these are sometimes common occurrences in these types of conditions. In this patient, she had autoantibodies against dopamine receptor D2L and an activation of the calmodulin CAM kinase enzyme. Again, symptoms of relapsing, remitting, and frequent flares. Her diagnosis was an idiopathic peripheral neuropathy, reflex sympathetic dystrophy, variants of migraines, Lyme disease, and a disorder of the autonomic nervous system. However, the lab results were positive for strep, positive for Lyme, babesia, mycoplasma, and what typically do see is when you have a tick-borne disease that it possibly and not too uncommonly is multiple different types of infections. So you see mycoplasma, EBV, and herpes. And the medical history was frequent strep infections since childhood and low IgGs and dental infections. Again, the family history was positive for a history of autoimmune disease and allergies. In this case, the patient, because this was treated with rituximab, and rituximab is a drug that removes B cells, CD20 markers, but B cells, again, remembering if a patient has been generating these autoimmune antibodies, there's memory B cells. And so sometimes patients will need to be treated with these to remove the offending B cells. There was a significant reduction in symptoms, and you can see that her D2L autoimmune antibodies went back to normal, as well as the calmodulin CAM kinase activation. I have one more here just as an additional, it's less complete, but just to show you that these aren't all as complex. We did see one which was treatment with antibiotics. This was a young girl who had verbal stimming and tics, we have a case study that was done with one of these patients, and you can see the complexities that were listed with the patient here. This one had a positive antibody for ganglioside GM1 as well as antitubulin. And in this case, they had caught this one early. Patient was treated with azithromycin and rapid improvements in the symptoms. And you can see both of these went back to baseline. So what are the common symptoms associated with this? As I mentioned, we run 5 of these targets. And when we see patients that have autoimmune antibodies against dopamine D1, we frequently see them associated with psychiatric symptoms, mood swings, depression, anxiety, irritability, aggression, delusions, and even in some cases, they may be exhibiting psychosis. When patients have antibodies directed against their dopamine D2L receptor, we typically will see more movement types of disorders. Things like chorea, and chorea being this fine motor movements. Sometimes they may have had an ADD, ADHD diagnosis, simply more so because they couldn't hold still, and possibly Parkinson's in older adults. When patients have antibodies directed against lysoganglioside GM1, we frequently see them complain of joint connective tissue pain, and we refer to this as more of a tic cluster. We often do see autoantibodies against tubulin, which is a brain protein that's highly concentrated in neurons, but it is in other cells of the body. And we typically see associated with this is complaints of obsessive compulsive disorder, but also brain fog. And so we'll see cognitive disorders, intrusive thoughts, patients presenting with various types of OCD. And as I mentioned about the CAM kinase 2 activity, it's actually a kinase enzyme that's heavily concentrated in the brain cells. And when it's activated by these antibodies, we see a sympathetic nervous system activation. What does that mean? Well, typically what we see is patients will exhibit symptoms of fight or flight behavior, like anxiety, separation anxiety, sensory sensitivities, easily startled. This also has an interesting correlation. We do often see it either activated or reactivated when there still is an underlying untreated infection. We can talk more about that later. However, the great thing is we see some amazing patient recoveries when they're diagnosed and properly treated. And this is one about Adam, and we have literally hundreds of examples of patients who either have been suffering for a long time, identified that this is a test they need to take, and found that they have autoimmune antibodies against this. In this case, Adam was potentially going to be institutionalized. And then after his treatment, and years later, his mom sent us this picture of him running cross country saying recovery is possible. He's 10,000 times better. So we have plenty of research to share with you if you're interested in looking at these studies, in case studies with schizophrenia, with autism, with PANDAS and PANS, with Lyme disease, and those can be available to you and on our website. So let me share, in wrapping up this, some commonalities of patients that are positive for these anti-neuronal antibodies in our autoimmune brain panel. Typically, we will see that they will be treatment resistant to standard neuropsychiatric drugs. Remember that can be one of the hallmarks, is that they're being treated for symptoms, but these are not the underlying root of the condition. There will be frequently associated infections, but remembering some of these infections can be subclinical. Sometimes they will come with a neurologic Lyme or post-treatment Lyme disease diagnosis, and as shown that there can be, and usually are, family history of autoimmune disorders. The rapidity or the suddenness of these onsets of this neuropsychiatric symptoms is also a clue. and the sudden onset of OCD. And again, the restrictive eating disorder we're referring to here is an OCD versus an identity issue, which has to do with the fear of choking, food contamination, or other things that are OCD related. Sometimes we will see motor, vocal tics, or creiform movements. And as mentioned, anxiety, rage, separation anxiety, and multiple emotional ability, and then developmental and behavioral regression or depression. In maybe about a third of the cases, you can see mydriasis. So you can see dilated pupils, urinary frequency, bedwetting, and then this relapsing remitting course and exacerbations. One of the neurologists we work for who's tested hundreds of patients and have taken care of and treated them successfully have said that if you ask them specifically, she says that they all have experienced suicidal ideation. So this is an important aspect to remember because these patients do need very responsive care. PANDAS and PANDAS diagnosis of symptoms, obviously. So in summarizing some key takeaways here is really obtain a thorough medical history, because a lot of these things you can pick up and you can see that this could be suspicious of being an infection-triggered immune-mediated disorder. And then gradual onset could really be sudden onset many years ago, but forgotten. And even if it's not sudden onset, it does not necessarily mean that this is not an immune-mediated infection-triggered disorder. Relapsing and remitting, in these cases where they see this intermittent ongoing flares. You can see a family history of autoimmune disorders, again, restrictive eating disorders, obsessional fears, and then this creiform movement. Some of the physicians will say you have these patients close their eyes, hold their hands straight out, and see if you actually can see these little piano playing finger movements where they can't control or keep their fingers still. Dysgraphia, inability to have, again, fine motor control, motor vocal tics, mydriasis. Some of the labs that are important, there are many, the strep test, ASO, DNase-B. Sometimes, again, strep is not the causative agent, but even sometimes it's in the family and it's being triggered. The ANA, again, it's only positive in over 50% of the patients, but it can indicate that there could be some immune dysfunction. Looking for occult infections, really looking for like Mycoplasma, Babesia, Bartonella, Lyme. And then, of course, we provide the Autoimmune Brain Panel that can be very helpful in your diagnosis. So overall, there's guidelines for treatment of PANDAS and PANS and infection-triggered autoimmune neuropsychiatric conditions. First, you really want to identify and treat all infections. Provided you've ruled out other causes, you want to look for viral, bacterial, fungal, patients that have multiple infections, because these are stimulating these antibodies. Provide some symptomatic relief as necessary, and typically what they say is go low and slow if you do use any kind of psychiatric medication, because again, these can exacerbate or they may even get worse on them. You do want to treat the inflammatory pathway because these immune-mediated disorders are triggering inflammation, and then as necessary to treat the immune dysregulation and the immune dysfunction. And these are some of these treatments that have been mentioned. So how can you order and do the testing results here through us in the results process? Many of you have already done that. Clearly, you make an account in our portal, and then a blood test will either be sent to the patient, their family, or you can stock them in your own clinic. We do charge $9.95 for the panel and require a $4.95 deposit. These are also used we bill as a courtesy for insurance, and do get some success in getting insurance coverage for many of these patients. The specimen will come to us overnight. And then it does take us between 2 and 3 weeks to run all 5 of these tests. We're a high complexity lab, and these are very complex. And in one case, it's a radioisotope assay. Once that's completed, it's uploaded into the portal. You'll get and receive a notification via email that your report is ready, and we will courtesy bill the patient's medical insurance. And then one thing that we do provide, and this is something that you can take advantage of, is online or just by phone access and consultation on many of the things that we've talked about today. There is also a journal article if you're interested in some of the treatment guidelines for PANDAS and PANS. This is in the Journal of Adolescent and Psychopharmacology, and that's available not only on our website, but also at the journal article. PANDAS and PANS Physician Network, has information available. And there's an interesting DVD and video called My Kid Is Not Crazy, if you choose to look at that. It chronicles several families that are struggling with the challenge of getting diagnosed and treatment for PANDAS and PANS. So as I mentioned, to wrap up here, we do provide free consultative services. You can either call, if you're a clinician, physician, direct line. It actually will go to Amy Cross, whom our psychiatric nurse that is moderating today. And then all other questions like logistics can go to our office. We're here to help. This is why we started the company, is because of this need. We also have in-service educational opportunities that we will provide to you, your staff, your clinic, and we will walk through more information on this. And then there are free resources available to you, such as we'll do these different types of webinars, the publications, videos, things that will be helpful for you as you take care of your patients. And then there's also some brochures, hard copy educational brochures for your patients on our website. And one thing to recognize, we are going through a brand change. We recently changed our name to Molecular Biosciences from Molecular Labs, so don't be confused by that. And the Cunningham Panel, which is now being known as our Autoimmune Brain Panel. And it's so that we can identify and add more value to it as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. And thank you for listening and for your work and taking care of your patients and being at the front line, bringing hope and healing to these many families. So thank you for your attention today.